John Thor, let me share a quote that's inspired a lot of thinking in my work. And it's from Lex Friedman, AI researcher at MIT and host of the Artificial Intelligence podcast. He says that AI is bigger than computing. It is our civilization's journey into understanding the human mind and creating echoes of it in the machine. For me, whether we get to artificial general intelligence, superintelligence, for me, that's just science fiction. But this journey towards understanding more about our minds, I think is fascinating because we have no point of comparison. We can't compare ourselves to whales, dolphins, chimpanzees. It doesn't make sense. We have no alien species to decide whether or not we're smart or not smart. And finally, we have AI, perhaps alternative intelligence, as at least some means of drawing comparison, some relativity, some answer to the questions, what are we and what aren't we? For me, that's a really exciting area of human exploration through AI. What does that mean to you?
Well, I think many people see it as a new beginning towards understanding who we are or what we are, but I actually see it as the continuation of a journey that we've been on forever. You know, if you look back at cave paintings, it's really interesting to see even just how we painted animals, trying to understand their structure, their movement, and then up to Renaissance era when people were trying to nail the accuracy in the depiction of what was going on in the world, and then even further than that, photography and video, and we've always been trying to document and understand. And I'd say that artificial intelligence almost combines the artistic pursuit of understanding it with the scientific from things like psychology, where we've always been gathering data about people, but then with psychology it became more structured, it became more focused on finding patterns, finding behaviors. And if we can do that using, yes, AI, can do it on a larger scale, we can gather it, and really where the margin for error comes in, I guess, is who's actually interpreting that information. You can look at a variety of behaviors and 5 different people will jump to 5 different conclusions based on it. And I think it's really interesting how we can really take the ins and outs of society now and even some older data as well and compare it and understand not just behavior, but how we learn, how we can be better, how we can look back at history and learn from it, because that's, I guess, yet another avenue to go down. There's the creative, there's psychology, and there's history, because with history as we learn it in schools, there's a lot that's glanced over. There's a lot of selective reading, because obviously we can't just read what happened every day for the past couple thousand years, but an AI with sufficient power could actually do that. And what that means for future historians might be absolutely mind-blowing.
If we go back to 700-800 years ago, there might be a battle taking place somewhere in England. One army would win, and it would be that army's scribe, no doubt, that would start recounting this battle, while the king or the leader would be dictating to them exactly how brilliant they were and how heroic he was, no doubt, and that he was at the front, clearly, leading the battle, all this good stuff, because why wouldn't you if you're of that type of personality? So we have very little information about history, and what we do have, you could say history was written by the victor. You're describing a situation here now where we have minute by minute, second by second accounts of what's going on, but so much. Where we had so little, now we have so much. And so combing through that to make any sense of what the real feelings were could still be really difficult, couldn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think anyone who's worked in any capacity around big data analysis will know that one of the key things you need to really sort out and figure out in the beginning is, what's your data source? Where are you going to source your data from? And that's something that I personally find really intriguing from that future historic perspective, where right now we're living in a time where, like you said, you have more information than we could possibly know what to deal with. If we just look at an example like YouTube, there's more video coming in every day than you could watch even if you were live streaming every single video. You'd need hundreds, if not thousands, of screens in order to try to catch up. And so the problem that future AI-empowered historians will have to deal with is what aspect of our current times are they looking to look into? Because if you're looking to understand how reporting is done today, no doubt you have to take into effect the misinformation being spread, because it is a big factor in our reporting right now. You see people sharing satire thinking that it's real. You see people sharing a Monty Python sketch thinking it's real. You see all these different things where people are outraged by things that may or may not have happened. And the way that we deal with that information down the line is going to be really critical, in my opinion, in how we continue to tell our story. Because misinformation has always been part of the game. And if we look at something we've discussed before, the democratization of technology, it has pluses and minuses really next to it, where you've got the ability for anyone to tell their story, but it also gives anyone the ability to tell any story, and anyone the ability to refute any story. So while it's easy to latch onto, and I've been guilty of this in the past, of saying, oh, how can people remain so ignorant? They just need to go on their smartphone and check the internet. But confirmation bias plays a big part in actually maintaining a lot of misinformation, because I could read 100 articles on something I disagree with, and I could come out of it going, man, what a crock of crap that was. I didn't learn anything from that. And whether I'm right or wrong about that, it's going to happen that way with a lot of people. And that, again, something we touched upon before, I think adds another layer of complexity to using technology like AI for that research purpose, because whose bias are we going to put into that AI when looking back?
And you and I can probably see through some of the headlines, but if you just think about some of the news recently around AI, that it could create sentences in your brain. It claimed a few months back from analyzing patterns of neural information. Last week we saw it could recreate faces of people from just pixelated or low-res images. What was the headline this week? 36 civilizations in the Milky Way. But they're just taking the very, very slimmest piece of news and then amplifying it. They're not saying there's 36 civilizations in the Milky Way. They're just referring to the Drake equation, which is where you look at the number of suns, the number of potential planets going around those. You do the math and you say, therefore, we think there could be this many alien civilizations. Nonsense, of course, because we have one example of life in the universe. You can't do an extrapolation from one. It's pick a number. And seeing through this is so difficult, though.
It can be, and especially because if we just look at the way that the media is run right now, and there's a great episode of the Patriot Act on Netflix about this, where it's showing the difference between smaller local news that often gets ridiculed as focusing on silly little things, but in reality, so many good investigative journalists that have uncovered amazing stories have come from local papers. And if you then look at the big headline grabbing giants in news, they want those big headlines. They want what will get you to click and get you to read, but not read too much, because they want to keep you clicking. And one of my favorite examples, and I actually used this when I was working with a big data analytics vendor a few years back, was a headline that I saw making the rounds, which was "Eating cashews lowers your risk of cancer." And this was spread across news articles the entire world over about how, eating a specific type of nut, I think at least it was cashew, but it's been a few years. And if you actually looked at the source and worked your way back, similar to what you talked about with the civilizations, working your way back and actually understanding how that conclusion was reached, it had been extrapolated from an experiment where they'd had a very small group of people they'd been looking into, and they didn't really look at any external factors outside of diet. So they didn't look at family histories, they didn't look at exercise. There were a myriad of factors that became overlooked. And they just saw, okay, the person that ate more cashews had less of a chance of getting cancer. And that's an attention-grabbing headline that had absolutely nothing to back it up except one piece of data in a very incomplete set of research.
I remember with my ex-partner's son, eggs, we're just constantly telling him to eat less eggs or more eggs, depending on what the latest news was. He was so confused, bless him, by whether he was allowed to eat eggs or not.
Yeah, and it's interesting because if you look at it, and we were talking about it's difficult often to see through this. It's interesting if you've ever known someone who jumps into every fad diet or every multi-level marketing or network marketing or pyramid, whatever you want to call all these different things. It's only a pyramid scheme after they've left it behind and decided that it wasn't actually worthwhile. Until then, it's an amazing business opportunity that they really want you to join. It's people like that, and I'm not judging those people because I understand where they're coming from. Because just like the news headlines that are trying to get you to click, these people know exactly what buttons to press. They find the people that, for example, with fad diets, they find people that are insecure or are worried about their health or the way they look, and they tell them, this person achieved what you want using this. Go for it. You sell loads of products, and especially if we go back to AI and the use of that, think about AI personalization on social media as an example. It'll push an echo chamber into your face of opinions that just drive you towards one conclusion. And that's a dangerous thing to not realize, because if we look at it, most people aren't really aware of it to the point where they discern or they doubt it, where they can actually make a fully rational decision. And I'm not surprised, because if no one's telling them to do it in a way where it empowers them to make those decisions on their own, it's difficult to come to that conclusion.
One thing that we were chatting about recently, a slight change of subject, was an idea that Dennis Rothman, who I'm now calling a polymath, by the way, after speaking to him, whether he refers to himself or not as that, we'll have to ask him. And he talks about the only time we really get change in the world is when chaos naturally comes back to order. And he said, you can try this yourself, and I won't try this, but he said, go out and start slapping people in the streets. Somebody will stop you at some point. It will happen, guaranteed. And he described this, particularly around climate change, that when it gets bad enough, when it gets crazy enough with storms, to a level that are interrupting business like COVID was, then that's when it comes back to order again. And I understood that. And then I thought, well, actually, it's not one thing. This is like kind of 8 billion moments every day of chaos that come back to order. Think about in the UK, where we've reduced our use of single-use plastic, and we're ejecting plastic bags in supermarkets, and a million other things as well that we are starting to get better at for our environment. What this is each person feeling, maybe, this is what I think, that it's getting too chaotic, and they want to bring it back in. But rather than it happening once on a mega scale with like climate change, It's happening millions of times every single day. And that is surging up to us really addressing climate change by each person noticing their life being too chaotic and wanting to bring it back into order in this area and hopefully many other areas and challenges that we have. That was my big takeaway from Dennis's words. Do you remember the interview with Dennis? Do you think
Yes, yes, I do. And I had a lot of takeaways from that, because I think, for example, that example of chaos, and I agree that with climate change as an example, it has been a lot of small moments, but I think the small moments have made people realize that the small moments towards order haven't really been enough. But what I think is good when we look at those small moments, or even these slightly bigger ones, like if we look at when Freon was practically outlawed, when the use of certain types of refrigerators or spray cans were outlawed, there have been big steps, but I think what people felt like were big steps was suddenly put into perspective when people realized things like, 70% of global emission coming from only 100 businesses. When people realized these huge steps that needed to be taken in order to make real impact. Because if we look at a line graph of the changes that everyday humanity has made in order to try and battle this versus the changes that have happened in climate change, they don't really go hand in hand. They're not quite parallel. And if we're looking to catch a problem before it becomes too big, we need to make bigger changes and demand bigger changes. And I think if we go back to the slapping example, if it's one person going out, slapping a bunch of people, there's more people there that can stop him. If 100% of companies are responsible for 70% of slapping in the world, we need something a little bit bigger than just one person to grab your hand and say, stop slapping. And I think this is the realization that people are coming to, not just with climate change, but you mentioned COVID. There's so many different elements of our social structure that we're incredibly vulnerable in a very weak state that people maybe didn't think about because they didn't need to until this hit. As an example, I read a lot of people's experiences with the benefits system in the UK versus the benefits system in Canada, where I have a couple of friends that live over there and mentioned that their system worked really quickly. It was really effective. People were very, very fast to receive the help that they needed. Whereas I've heard from people here getting stuck in a loop of needing to identify themselves through identification agencies. I saw a headline the other day that said millions had fallen through the cracks of government assistance. You've got all these promises about helping renters during this time, helping landlords with their mortgages. And then I'm seeing on Twitter people saying, actually, all these rental freezes, all these payment holidays have just accrued debt. And now that that period is coming to an end, everyone's coming to collect. And to that point, I think we actually come full circle, where we realize that the chaos that we were experiencing is actually part of a dysfunctional order, because there was an order to it. It just wasn't in our favor.
I see that. Yeah, I see that. I mean, it is a chaotic world, but there's also a lot of pressure downwards that does create order. Let's put a pin in this conversation for this moment, and perhaps we can revisit some more themes if you're interested to in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you.